I was hungry and stiff. Lunch offered a decent respite, even if I would have to tolerate Vervuk. Bastian Vervuk was 32 standard years old, and had been an inquisitor for 7 months. He was a fresh-faced boy, he seemed to me, of medium height with a centre-parted bowl of heavy blonde hair and slightly hooded, earnest eyes. He looked like he was yearning all the time, yearning and swept up in some spiritual rapture. He had a brilliantly ordered mind, and had doubtlessly served Ozma well as an interrogator. But now his hour had come, and he was pushing up the ranks with immodest ambition. His transfer to Rorken's staff for supplementary schooling had probably been the result of Ozma losing patience with him. Ozma was like that. Ozma was still the same Ozma who had plagued me 50 years before, except that now he was set to inherit Orsini's role as Grand Master of the Inquisition, Helicon's subsector. Grandmaster Orsini was dying, and Ozma was his chosen heir. It was just a matter of time. Rorken was dying too, if the rumours were true. Soon I would be friendless in the high ranks of the Ordos Helicon. Thanks to Rorken's infirmity, I had acquired Vervuk. He was simply a burden I had to carry. His manner, his yearning, his bright eagerness, his damned questions. I stood in the minster's warm sacristy, sipping wine and eating thick seed bread, smoked fish and a strong, waxy cheese locally produced in the Uvige. I was chatting with Rassi, a pale, quiet senior inquisitor from the Ordo Malleus, who had become a firm friend in recent years, despite his association with the caustic Ozma. "A month, you think, Gregor? For this poll? 2, maybe 3. He sighed, toying his fork around his plate, his silver-headed cane tucked under his arm to free his hands. "Maybe 6, if they each bring a bloody partner, eh?" We laughed. Koth slid past us to refill his glass and cast us a nod. "Don't look now," Rassi murmured. "But your fan club is here." "Oh, crap. Don't leave me with him," I hissed, but Rassi had already moved away. Vervuk slid up beside me. He was balancing a dish of game terrine, pickles and salted spry that he clearly had no intention of eating. "It goes well, I think," he started. "Oh, very well. Of course, you must have great experience of these sessions, so you know better than I. But a good start, would you not say?" "Yes, a good start. Prid is the key. He'll turn the lock of House Samag. I'm quite sure of it. Mendereff's work was something, wasn't it? The cross-exam? So deft, so well judged. The way he broke Prid. I expected no less. Quite something. Yes, indeed." I felt I had to say something. "Your choice of Prid, as the first accused. Well judged. Well, a good decision, anyway." He looked at me as if I was his one true love, and I'd just promised to do something significant. "Lord, I am truly honoured that you say so. I only did what I thought best. Really, Lord, to hear that from you fills my heart with—" "Stewed fish?" I asked, offering him the bowl. "No, thank you, Lord." "It's very good," I said, slathering my bread with it. "Though, like so many fine things in life, you can quite quickly have too much of it." He didn't take the hint. The hint would most likely have to be embossed on the tip of a high-X bolter round and fired up his nose before he'd notice it. "I feel, Lord," he said, setting his untouched dish aside, "that I can learn so much from you. This is an opportunity that few of my status get." "I can't fathom why," I said. He smiled. "I almost feel I should thank the miserable tumours eating at my Lord Rorken for this chance." "I feel I owe some sort of payback to them too," I muttered. "It's so rare that if I may say, veteran inquisitor such as yourself, a field inquisitor, I mean, not a desk-bound lord, participates in a process like this and mingles with lesser officers such as me. Lord Rorken has always spoken so highly of you. There is much I want to ask you, so many things. I have read up on all your works, the Pugleo conspiracy, for example. I have reviewed that from end to end, and I have so many queries, and other matters." Here it comes, I thought. And there it came. The demon hosts, and Quixos. There is, oh, so much in that demands the attention of a scholar such as myself. Can you give me personal insight? Perhaps not now. Later. We could dine together and talk. Well, perhaps. The records are so incomplete, or rather, restricted. I yearn to know how you dealt with profanity and Cherubael. I was waiting for the name. Still, hearing it, I winced. Cherubael. That's what they all asked. Every last neophyte inquisitor I met. That's what they all wanted to know. Damn their interest. It was over and done with. Cherubael. For 150 years, the demon had plagued my dreams and made each one a nightmare. For a century and a half it had been in my head, a shadow at the horizon of sanity, a softly breathing shape in the dark recesses of my consciousness. I had done with Cherubael. I had vanquished it. But still the neophytes asked, and swirled up the memories again for me. I would never tell them the truth. How could I? Lord? I'm sorry, Vervug, my mind wandered. What did you say? I said, isn't that one of your men? Godwin Fishig, dressed in a long black coat, still powerful and imposing after all these years, had entered the sacristy by the rear door and was looking around for me. I handed my plate and glass to the startled Vervug and went directly across to him. I didn't expect to see you here, I whispered, drawing him aside. Not really my thing, but you'll thank me for busting in. What is it? Pay dirt, Gregor. You'll never guess in 100 centuries who we've turned up. Presuming we don't have 1,000,000 years, Fishig, tell me. Thuring, he said. We've found Thuring. Vengeance, in my opinion, is never an adequate motive for an inquisitor's work. I had sworn to make Thuring pay for the death of my old friend Midas Betancourt, of course, but the 80 years since Midas's murder had been filled to distraction with more weighty and more pressing cases. There had not been time or opportunity to spare the months, perhaps years, required to hunt Thuring down. He was not worth the effort. At least that is what Lord Rawkin always counselled me when I brought the matter up. Fade Thuring, an inconsequential player in the shadow world of heresy that lurks within imperial society. A nothing who would run foul of justice soon enough all by himself. Undeserving of my attention. Not worth the effort. Indeed, for a long time I had believed him dead. My agents and informants had kept me appraised of his activities, and early in 352.M41 I had learned he had fallen in with an outworld fraternity of chaos called the Hearthood, or sometimes the Chimes of the World Clock. They practiced a stylized worship of the blood god, in the form of a local tribe's minor swine deity called Ulkit, or Yulket, or Ulket. The name differed in every source consulted, and for some months had plagued the crop world Harsana. Their cult priest took the ceremonial guise of the swine butcher or culler, who, in older times, had travelled between the communities of Harsana at the end of each autumn, slaughtering the livestock ready for the cold months. It was an old tradition, one that mixed ritual bloodletting with the dying of the calendar year, and is common throughout the Imperium. Pre-Imperial Terror had just such a myth once, called the Hallows, or the Eve of Hallowing. The cult leader was Amel Sanks, the corrupter of Lix, reappearing for the first time after a century of hiding to spread his poisons. Sanks was so notorious a heretic that once it became known that he was involved, the initial inquisitorial efforts to prosecute the Hearthood multiplied 100-fold, and a kill team of the Adepta Sororitas, led by Inquisitor Adalorn, obliterated them in a raid on Harsana's northern capital. In the aftermath, it was discovered that Sanks had already sacrificed most of his minor followers as part of a ritual that Adalorn's raid had interrupted. Thuring was one of his second tier of trusted acolytes in the Hearthood. His body was listed as amongst the ritual victims. Midas's killer was dead, or so I had thought until that moment, in the sacristy of Ariel's Minster. Are you sure of this? Fishig looked at me with a shrug, as if I should have trouble doubting his words. Where is he? That's the part you're going to love. He's here. They had taken their places already in the main vault of the Minster by the time I joined them. House Samag had brought out a militant advocate to answer for them, and already he was strenuously trying to establish the fragility of Udwin Prid's testimony. I slammed my fist on the table to shut him up. Enough! This examination is suspended. My fellow inquisitors swung round to look at me. It's what? Asked Menderev. Until further notice, I added. But, Koth began. Gregor, asked Rassi, what are you doing? This is highly irregular, Vervug said. I know, I told him, right into his face. He flinched. My Lord Chief Examiner, asked the Samarg's advocate, stepping towards the bench nervously, may I presume to ask when this hearing might recommence? When I'm ready, I snarled. When I'm good and ready. Chapter 2. Betancourt, blood up. Fischig's briefing. Arming for battle. It caused quite a stir. What am I saying? Of course it caused quite a stir. Crowds quickly gathered outside the minster in the bright afternoon sunshine. The archivists and pamphleteers who had been dozing in the public gallery scampered off to promulgate the news. Even the confessors and preachers who had been wandering the streets, lambasting the common folk with bilious sermons against heresy, followed the crowds to the minster square. You can't just suspend a court of examination, Mendereff raged at me. I shoved him aside and strode on down the long aisle towards the main doors of the minster. Bequin and Fischig were in step with me, and Amos scurried to catch up. You say here, what do you mean? I asked Fischig, dragging off my fur-trimmed cloak and my chain of office and tossing them onto a pew. Miquel, he said. It's an island in the northern polar circle, about 2 hours transit time. Eisenhorn! Eisenhorn! Mendereff yelled behind me, a twitter of agitated voices around him. You're sure it's him? I've reviewed Godwin's findings, snapped Bequin. It's Thurring, all right. I'd put money on it. We reached the end of the minster's nave and were crossing towards the entrance arch and daylight. A hand caught my sleeve. I turned. It was Rassi. What are you doing, Gregor? This is holy work you're abandoning. I'm not abandoning anything, Powell. Didn't you hear me? I'm suspending it. This examination is all about feeble little recidivists and their ungodly habits. I'm set on a true heretic. Really? Come along if you don't believe me. Very well. As I pressed on through the great doorway, Rassi turned and intercepted Koth and Mendereff. He shouted down their objections. I'm going with him, I heard him say to them. I trust Eisenhorn's judgment. If he was wrong to break the court here, I'll testify to that when I return. We were out in the daylight. Mobs of civilians gazed at us, some shielding their eyes from the sun's glare where the blossom-heavy trees of the square failed to shade them. Medea? I asked Fischig. Already called in, I presumed. I hope that's all right. Does she know? Fischig glanced at Bequin and Amos. Yes, I couldn't hide it from her. Almost on cue, Medea's voice crackled over my vox-link. Aegis descending, the armour of God, by 2. She reported in glossier code, her voice hard-edged and bitter. Damn it, I said. Clear the square! Fischig and Bequin ran forward into the crowd. Clear the area! Bequin yelled. Come on, move! Move now! Fischig bellowed. No one obeyed. Fischig pulled out his handgun and fired into the air. Shrieking, the crowd surged back and streamed away down the approach streets. Just in time. My gun cutter, all 450 tons of it, swung in over the roof of the Ariel Municipal Library and descended on wailing thrusters into the Minster Square. The downwash blew the blossom off the trees and filled the air with petals like confetti. I felt the ground shake as the vessel set down hard. Flagstones cracked under the steel pads of the extended landing struts. Casements around the square shattered. The trees in the square billowed furiously in the outrush of the jets. The nose ramp whined open. I hurried up the ramp with Amos and Bequin, pausing to beckon Rassi aboard. Leaning on his cane, he walked more slowly than us. Fischig waited at the foot of the ramp, sternly ushering in the other members of my retinue, who had been stationed in the vicinity of the minster. Kara Swoll, who had been monitoring the crowd from a caffeine house opposite the library. Duclane Haar, whose sniper-variant Longlas had been tracking the traffic around the minster's main door from the roof of the administratum's tithe barn. Bex Begandy, who had been posing as a homeless mutant begging for alms in the port of St. Beckwell's chapel, his pistols concealed under his pauper's bowl. Fischig pulled them all in and then ran up the ramp, hauling on the lever that slammed the ramp shut. Almost immediately the gun cutter rose again, puffing out a cloud of blossom. In the entry bay, I took a quick head count. "Vervuk, what are you doing here?"
"As my Lord Rawkin instructed," he said. "I go where you go, Lord."
We gained altitude, climbing into the stratosphere for the transit north. My own people knew their places and tasks, but I pulled Kara Swole aside and told her to make sure Rassi and Vervuk were comfortable. Inquisitor Rassi deserves every courtesy, but don't give Vervuk a millimetre. Don't let him get in the way. Kara Swole was a well-muscled acrobat dancer from Bonaventure who had assisted one of my investigations 3 years before, and had enjoyed the experience so much she'd asked to join my retinue permanently. She was small and lithe, with very short red hair, and her muscular frame made her look almost stocky, but she was nimbler and more agile than just about anyone I had ever met, and had a genuine flair for surveillance. She'd become a valued member of my team, and she'd told me more than once that the employment I offered her was infinitely preferable to her previous life in the circus arenas of her homeworld. Kara glanced in Vervuk's direction.
"He looks like a ninker to me," she murmured.
Ninker was her insult of choice, a slang term from the circus Creole. I'd never had the heart to ask her what it meant. "I believe you're right about that," I whispered back. "Keep an eye on him, and make sure Rassi is happy. When we get to the destination, I want you and Ha guarding them with your lives."
"Understood."
I gathered Fischig, Bequin, Amos, Ha, and Burgundy around the chart table for a briefing, and also summoned Daholt, my astropath. "All right. How did you find him?" Fischig smiled. He was obviously pleased with himself. "The audit turned him up. At least, it turned up some appetizing clues that made me look harder and find him. He'd been operating in 3 of the northern seaports, and also in the capital. I couldn't believe it at first. I mean, we thought he was dead. But it's him." An audit was part of my standard operating practice, and I'd set one going the moment Lord Rawkin prevailed on me to conduct the examination 4 months earlier. Under Fischig's leadership, a large part of my support staff, over 30 specialists, had gone ahead to Jura to carry it out. The purpose of an audit was twofold. First, to review and recheck the cases to be presented for examination to make sure we weren't wasting our time and that we were in possession of all the relevant data. It wasn't that I didn't trust Lord Rawkin's preparation. I just like to be certain about what I'm prosecuting. Secondly, it was to investigate the possible existence of heretical cases that might have been overlooked by the examination. I was going to be devoting a lot of my time and resources to this clean-up of Jura, and I wanted to make sure I was being thorough. If there was other recidivism here, I wanted to root it out at the same time. Fischig and the audit team had made a virtual fingertip search of the planetary records, cross-checking even minor anomalies against my database. It proved that Rawkin's preparatory work had been excellent, for very little turned up. Except Fade Thuring. Fischig had first discovered some off-world financial transactions that flagged because they linked to merchant accounts on Thracian Primaris that Thuring had been associated with 20 years earlier. Fischig had backtracked painstakingly through shipping registers and accommodation listings and had lucked upon some footage recorded by a mercantile company's security pict. The man captured digitally by the pict recorder bore a striking similarity to Fade Thuring. "As far as we can make out," said Fischig, "Thuring's been on Jura for about a year. Arrived aboard a free trader last summer and took up residence in Hainstown on an 18-month merchant's visa. Uses the name Iliam Vowis and claims to be a dealer in aeronautical engineering. Not short of cash or connections. Most of the business seems legit, though he's been buying up a lot of machine parts and tooling units and hiring on a fair number of local tech adepts. From the outside, it looks like he's setting up a repair and servicing outfit. What he's actually doing is not yet clear." "Has he purchased or rented any workspace property?" asked Burgundy. "No, that's one of the discrepancies." Fischig looked up at me. "He keeps moving around. Difficult to track. But 4 days ago, I got a good lead that he was in the northern seaport, Finyard. So I sent Nail to get a proper look." Harlan Nail, a long-serving member of my cadre and an ex-bounty hunter, was one of my finest. "What did he find?" "He was too late to catch Thuring. He'd already gone, but Nail got into the hotel suite he had been using before their housekeeping could clean it up, and got enough hair and tissue fibers to run a gene scan against the samples we hold on file. Perfect match. Iliam Vowis is Fade Thuring." And you say he's now on a polar island? Fischig nodded. Nail took off after Thuring, found out he had arranged passage to this place Mikol. Used to be a PDF listening station there years ago, but it's uninhabited now. We don't know what he's doing there, or even if he's been there before. Nail should have reached the island himself by now. He hasn't checked in, but the magnetosphere is wild as hell up near the pole, so comms are out. Long range, anyway. This is excellent work, old friend, I told Fischig, and he smiled appreciatively. Godwin Fischig, once a chastener in the arbites of hubris, and a law enforcer of considerable ability, was one of my real veterans. He'd served at my side for 15 decades now, for as long as Elizabeth Beckwin. Only Amos had been with me longer. The three of them were my rock, my foundation, the cornerstones of my entire operation. And they were my friends. Amos provided wisdom and an unimaginably vast resource of knowledge. Beckwin was an untouchable, and ran an academy of similarly gifted individuals called the Distaff. They were my greatest weapon, a corps of psychically blank individuals who could be used to block even the most powerful psychers. Beckwin was also my emotional rudder. I confided in her more than the others, and looked to her for support when I was troubled. Fischig was my conscience. He was an imposing man with an age-grizzled face that was now quite jowly. A thin down of grey hair covered his scalp, where once he had been blonde. The scar under his milky eye had gone pink and glossy over time. Fischig was a formidable warrior, and had gone through some of the worst times at my side. But there was none more single-minded than he, none so pure, puritanical, if you will. Good and evil, law and chaos, humanity and the warp. They were simple, black and white distinctions for him. I admired that so. Time, experience, and incident had greyed my attitudes somewhat. I depended on Fischig to be my moral compass. It was a role he seemed happy to perform. I think that's why he had stayed with me so long, when by now he could have become a commissioner of arbites, a divisional prefect, maybe even a planetary governor. Being the conscience of one of the subsector's most senior inquisitors was a calling that gave him satisfaction. I wondered sometimes if Fischig regretted the fact that I had never sought higher office in the Inquisition. I suppose, given my track record and reputation, I could have become the Lord of an Ordo by now, or at least been well on my way. Lord Rawkin, who had become something of a mentor to me, had often expressed his disappointment that I had not taken up the opportunities he had offered to become his heir. He had been grooming me for a while as successor to the control of the Ordo Xenos, Helican sub. But I had never fancied that kind of life. I was happiest in the field, not behind a desk. Of all of them, Fischig would have benefited most if I had followed that kind of course. I could well imagine him as the commander-in-chief of the Inquisitorial Guard Helican. But he had never expressed any hint of unhappiness in that regard. Like me, he liked the challenge of field work. We made a good team, for a long time. I'll never forget that, and despite what fate was to bring, I'll always thank the God Emperor of mankind for the honor of working alongside him for as long as I did. Amos, I said, perhaps you'd like to review Fischig's data and see if you can make any further deductions. I'm interested in this island. Punch up the data, maps, archives. Tell me what you find.
Of course, Gregor,
Amos said. His voice was very thin and reedy, and he was more hunched and wizened than ever. But knowledge still absorbed him, and I think it nourished him in the way that food or wealth or duty, or even love, kept other men going way past their prime. Fischig will assist you, I said, and perhaps Inquisitor Rassi, too. I want a workable plan of operations in, I checked my chronometer, 60 minutes. I need to know everything it is possible or pertinent to know before we hit the ground. And I want a positive, uncomplicated plan of what we do when we get there. Elizabeth.
Gregor,
get in contact with as many of our specialists here on Jura as you can find, and get them moving in to support us. Distaff especially. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. I want to know we have solid backup following us. She nodded graciously. She was a brilliant man-manager. Beckwin was still as demure and beautiful as the day I had met her, a century and a half before. A spectacular testament of the way imperial science can counter the effects of aging. Only the faintest creases in the corner of her eyes and lips betrayed the fact that she was not a stunning woman in her late 30s. Lately she had taken to walking rather regally with a shoulder-high ebony cane for support, claiming that her bones were old, but I believe that to be an affectation designed to reinforce her very senior and matriarchal role. Only when I looked into her eyes could I see the distances of age. Her life had been hard, and she had witnessed many terrible things. There was a sort of wistful pain in the depths of her gaze, a profound sadness. I knew she loved me, and I loved her as much as any being I had ever known. But long ago, mutually, we had set that aside. I was a psyker, and she was an untouchable. Whatever the sadness we both felt because of our denied love, being together would have been so much more agonizing. "Dahalt!" "Sir," the astropath answered smartly. He had been with me for 20 years, by far the longest stretch any astropath had managed in my employ. They wear out so quickly, in my experience. Dahalt was a vital, burly man with a spectacular waxed moustache that I believe he grew to compensate for his shaved head. He was certainly powerful and able, and had taken to my regime of work well. Only in the past few years had he started to show the signs of psychic exhaustion. The shallow, drawn skin, the hunted look, the aphasia. I dearly hoped I would be able to retire him on a pension before his calling burned out his mind. "Check ahead," I told him. "Fischig says the magnetosphere is blocking Vox traffic, but Thuring may be using astropaths. See what you hear." He nodded and shuffled away to his compact screened cabin under the bridge to connect his skull plugs to the astrocommunication network. I turned last to Bex Burgundy and Duclane Haar. Haar was an ex-Imperial Guard marksman for the 50th Gudronite Rifles, a regiment I had an old association with. Of medium build, he wore a matte anti-flecked body glove, the cap pin of his old outfit dangling round his neck on a cord. He had lost a leg in action on Wickard, and been invalided out of service. But he was as good a shot with the sniper variant Longlas as Dudge Husman, now long gone, and in a manner I sorely regretted. Haar was clean-shaven, and his brown hair was as neatly trimmed as it had been in the days of parade ground drill. He wore an optic target enhancer that clamped around the side of his skull, looping over his ear, and could drop the articulate arm of the foresight down over his right eye for aiming. He preferred the enhancer to a conventional rifle-mounted scope, and with his tally of clean hits, I wasn't about to argue. Bex Burgundy was a rogue, in the strictest sense of the term. A desperado, old Commodus Voke would have called him. An outlaw, scammer, con artist, and lowlife, born in the slums of Sameter, a world I had no love for, as I'd once left a hand there. He was one of Harlan Nail's recruits, possibly one of his intended bounties who had been offered a life-or-death choice, and had joined my team 6 years before. Burgundy was unspeakably cocky and prodigiously skilled with handguns. Tall, no more than 35 years old, he was not exactly handsome, but oozed a devastating charisma. He was dark-haired, a jet-black goatee perfectly trimmed around his petulant smile, with hard cheekbones and corpse-white skin dye contrasting with the wipes of black coal under his dangerously twinkling eyes, as was the gang custom of the slums. He was dressed in a leather armor body jacket, embroidered with rich silk thread and preposterous panels of sequins. But there was nothing remotely comical about the paired Hecutor auto-pistols holstered under his arms in a custom-made, easy-draw rig. "We're in for a fight when we get down, make no mistake," I told them. "Rocking good news," said Burgundy with a hungry smile. "Just point me at the target, sir," said Haar. I nodded, pleased. "No showboating, you hear me? No grandstanding." Burgundy looked hurt. "As if," he complained. "Actually, I was thinking of you, Haar," I replied. Haar blushed. He had proved to be extremely eager. A killer's instinct. "You can trust me, sir," he said. "This is important. I know it's always important, but this is personal. No screw-ups." "We're after the guy who popped D's dad, right?" asked Burgundy. D. That's what they called Medea Betancourt, my pilot. "Yes, we are. For her sake, stay alert." I went up into the cockpit. The high-altitude cloudscape was sliding past outside. Medea was flying like a demon. She was just over 75 years old. Just a youngster still. Stunning, volatile, brilliant, sexy. She had inherited her late father's pilot skills as surely as she had inherited his dark Glavian skin and fine looks. She was wearing Midas's cerise flying jacket. "You need to stay focused, my dear," I said.
"I will,"
she replied, not looking up from the controls. "I mean it. This is just a job."
"I know. I'm fine."
"If you need to stand down, it can be arranged."
"Stand down?"
She snapped the words and looked round at me sharply, her large brown eyes wet with angry tears.
"This is my father's killer we're going for. All my life I've waited for this. Literally. I'm not going to stand down, boss."
She had never known her father. Fade Thuring had murdered Midas Betancourt a month before her birth. "Fine. I want you with me. I'd like you with me. But I will not allow emotion to cloud this."
"It won't."
"I'm glad to hear it." There was a long silence. I turned to go.
"Gregor,"
she said softly. "Yes, my dear."
"Kill the bastard. Please."
In my cabin I made my preparations. The soft robes I had been wearing as Lord Chief Examiner went in favour of an armoured body glove, steel-reinforced knee boots, a leather jacket, and a heavy storm coat with armoured shoulder panels. I pinned my badges of office on my chest, my inquisitorial rosette at my throat. I selected my 3 primary weapons from the safe: a large-caliber bolt pistol, the rune staff hand-made for me by Magos Bure of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the curved, pentagram-engraved force sword that I had commissioned to be forged from the broken half of the Carthian warblade, Barbarisata. I blessed each one. I thought of Midas Betancourt, dead nearly a century now. Barbarisata purred in my hands. Chapter 3. Miquol. Jura PDF Listening Station 272. The Turnabout. Miquol was a vast volcanic slab jutting from the black waters of the polar ocean, 16 kilometers long and 9 wide. From the air it looked bleak and lifeless. Sheer cliffs 100 meters high edged its shape, but its interior was a ragged desert of crags and rock litter. "Life signs?" I asked. Medea shrugged. We weren't picking anything up, but it was obvious from the jumping, hiccuping displays that the magnetics were playing hell with our instruments. "Shall I set down topside?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "Bring us around for another pass to the south first." We banked. Cloud cover was low, and banks of chill fog swathed the island's gloomy sprawl. Fishig joined us in the cockpit. "You said there was an old facility here?" I said. He nodded. "A listening station, used by the Planetary Defense Force in the early years after the liberation. Been out of use for a couple of decades now. It's high up in the interior. I've got a chart, Ref." "What's that?" Medea asked, pointing down at the southern cliffs. Down below we could make out some derelict jetties, landing docks and prehab sheds clustered on a sea-level crag at the foot of the cliff. Some kind of vertical trackway, a row of rusting pylons, ran from the back of some of the larger sheds up the face of the cliff. "That's the landing facility," said Fishig. "Used to serve the island when there were still PDF staffers stationed here." "There's a sea craft down there," I said. "Fairly large." I looked across at Medea. "Put down there, the crag there beside the sheds. The cliffs will keep the cutter out of sight too." It was bitingly cold, and the air was dank with fog and sea spray. Amos and de Holt stayed with Medea aboard the cutter, and the rest of us ventured out. On the ramp, I turned to Vervuk. "You stay aboard too, Bastian." He looked dismayed. That damned yearning look again. "I'd like to feel I have someone I can count on watching the cutter." I lied, smoothly. His expression changed immediately. Pride, self-importance. "But of course, Lord." We crossed the crag in the lee of the high cliffs towards the prefabs. They were old pattern Imperial modulars, shipped in and bolted together. Time and weather had much decayed them. Windows were boarded, and the fibre-ply walls were rotten and patched. Rain and spray had scrubbed away most of the surface paint and varnish, but in places you could just make out the faded crest of the Jura PDF. Har and Fishig led the way. Har had his long las raised to his shoulder, his foresight dropped into place, hunting for targets as he paced forward. Fishig carried a las rifle in one hand. A motion tracker unit was buckled over his left shoulder, whirring and ticking as it subjected Fishig's immediate vicinity to invisible waves of vigilance. Rassi and I were close behind them, with Elizabeth, Kara, and Burgundy at the rear. Fishig pointed to the vertical trackway we had seen from the air.
Looks like a cable carriage or a funicular railway. Runs up to the cliff top.
Functional? Rassi inquired.
I doubt it, sir, said Fishig. It's old and hasn't been maintained. I don't like the look of those cables.
The main lifting lines were heavy-gauge hawsers, but they swung slackly in the wind between the pylons and showed signs of fraying.
There are stairs, though, Fishig added, right up the cliff alongside the track.
We crossed to the jetties. They, too, were badly decayed. Rusting chains slapped and clanked with the sea swell. The craft moored there was a modern ocean-going ekranoplane, 20 meters long and sleekly grey. Stencils on the hull told us it was a licensed charter vessel from Finyard, presumably the vessel Thuring had hired to bring him here. There was no sign of crew, and the hatches were locked down. There wasn't even a hint of standby automation.
"Want me to force entry?" asked Kara.
Maybe. I was interrupted by a shout from Ha. He was standing in the entrance of the nearest prefab, a docking shed that stood over the water on stilt legs. Ha gestured inside as I joined him. In the half-light, I could see 4 bodies slumped on the duckboards of the dry well. Fishig was kneeling beside them.
"Local mariners. Their papers are still in their pockets. Registered operators from Finyard."
"Dead how long?"
Fishig shrugged. "Maybe a day. Single shot to the back of the head in each case."
"The crew from the Seacraft." He rose.
"Makes sense to me."
"Why didn't they dump the bodies at sea?" Ha wondered. "Because an ekranoplane is a specialist vehicle and they needed the crew alive to get them here," I suggested. "But if they killed them once they were here," Ha began. I was way ahead of him. "Then they're not planning on leaving the island. Not the way they arrived, at any rate." I had Kara Swoll break into the ekranoplane. There was nothing useful inside, just a few items of equipment and personal clutter belonging to the murdered crew. The passengers had taken everything else with them. The only thing we learned was that Thuring might have as many as 20 men with him on Mickwal, giving the ekranoplane's load capacity and the number of emergency life jackets. "They've gone inland," I decided, "and that's what we're going too."
"Shall I get Dee to fire up the cutter?"
Burgundy asked. "No," I said. "We'll go in on foot. I want to get as close to Thuring as possible before he makes us. We can call in the cutter if we need it."
"Medea won't like that, Gregor," said Bequin.
I knew that damn well. I believe Medea deserved every chance to avenge her father. Vengeance might not be an appropriate motive for an inquisitor, but as far as I was concerned, it was perfectly fine for a headstrong, passionate combat pilot. However, her passion could become a liability. I wanted Thuring taken cleanly, and I didn't relish the prospect of Medea going off in a blind fury. Bequin was right, though. Medea really didn't like it.
"I'm coming."
"No."
"I'm coming with you."
"No." I caught her by the arms and stared into her face. "You are not. Not yet."
"Gregor,"
she wailed. "Listen. Think about this
logically. That bastard killed my father at—"
Listen. I don't want the cutter giving us away too early. That means leaving it here. But I do want the cutter ready to respond at a moment's notice, and that means you have to stay here on standby. Medea, you're the only one who can fly it." She shook off my grip and turned away, gazing at the rolling surge of the ocean. "Medea."
"Okay. But I want to be there when—"
"You will. I promise."
"You swear it?"
"I swear it." Slowly she turned to look at me. Her eyes were still bright with hurt.
"Swear it on your secrets," she said.
"What?"
"Do it the Glavian way.
"Swear it on your secrets." I remembered this now. The Glavian custom. They considered an oath most binding if it was sworn against private, personal secrets. In the old days, I suppose, that meant one Glavian pilot swearing to exchange valuable technical or navigational secrets with another as an act of faith and honor. Midas had made me do it once, years before. He'd made me swear to a 3-month sabbatical at a time when I was working too hard. It hadn't been possible, because of one case or another, and I ended up having to tell him that I adored Elizabeth, and wished with every scrap of my being that we could be together. That was the deepest, darkest secret I had been carrying at the time. How things change. "I swear it on my secrets," I told her.
"On your gravest secret."
"On my gravest secret." She spat on the ground and then quickly licked her palm and held out her hand. I mirrored her gestures and clasped her hand. We left her with Amos, Dahult, and Vervuk at the gun cutter and made our way up the cliff stairs. It was raining by the time we reached the top, and the last few flights were treacherously wet. Salty wind flapped in from the sea, gusting into our coats and clothes. I was worried about Paul Rassi. Though he didn't look it, he was over a century older than me, and the climb left him pale and breathless. He was relying on his cane more than before. "I'm all right," he said. "Don't fuss." "Are you sure, Paul?" He smiled.
"I've been in the courts and privy chambers for too many of the last few years, Gregor. This is almost an adventure. I'd forgotten how much I liked this."
Rassi raised his cane and flourished it ahead of us like a sabre.
"Shall we?"
We advanced into the hinterland of Miquol. Fischig had an Auspex locked off on the old PDF base, so we headed for that as a place to start. The sky was the luminous hazy white of a blown valve screen. Stripes of fog clung to the ground like walls of smoke. The rain was constant. The landscape was a mix of jagged upthrust outcrops and steep, shadowy valleys littered with scree. Boulders were scattered all around, some the size of skulls, some the size of battle tanks. The rock was dark, almost the color of anthracite, and occasionally it was splintered out in cascades of volcanic glass. A forbidding, grey place. A monochrome world. After 2 hours we passed a rust-eaten tower of girders capped by sagging, corroded alloy petals that had once been a communications dish. One of the peripheral receivers of the listening station. "We're close," said Fischig, consulting his Auspex. "The PDF base is over the next headland." Jura PDF Listening Station 272 had been established shortly after the planet's liberation by the newly formed Planetary Defense Force as part of a global overwatch program. Through it, and around 300 facilities like it, the Jura PDF had been able to maintain a round-the-clock watch of orbital traffic, local shipping lane activity, and even general warp space movements, providing the planet with an early warning network and gathering vital tactical intelligence for this part of the subsector in general. Over a period of 20 years following the annexation of the territory, the network had gradually been run down, eventually supplanted by a string of scanner beacons in high orbit and a slaved subnet of sensor buoys seeded throughout the Jura system. The PDF had finally vacated the obsolete stations some 3 decades before, undoubtedly grateful that they would never have to tolerate a tour of duty on this harsh rock again. The station lay on the shore of a long polar lake, framed by ragged infant mountains to the north. It was an exposed place, bitten by the sub-zero winds. The lake, smudged with mist, was a flat, gleaming mirror of oil-dark water, its glassy surface occasionally disturbed by a flurry of wind ripples. On the grey shore there were 18 longhouses arranged in a grid around a drum-like generator building, a hangar large enough to shelter several troop carriers or orbital interceptors, a cluster of store barns, a number of machine shops, a small ecclesiarchy chapel, a central command post with adjoining modules arranged in a radial hub, and the main dish array. All of it had succumbed to the feral ministry of the environment. The modules and prefabs were aged and dilapidated, windows covered with boards. The roadways between the prefabs were littered with rusting trash, old fuel drums, the carcasses of trucks, piles of flaking storm shutters. The vast main dish, angled towards the west, was a skeleton of its former self, just a hemisphere described by bare girders and dangling struts. In the black mirror of the lake, its reflection seemed like that of a giant, bleached ribcage. But it looked to me more like the ruins of an orrery, just the shattered remains of the central solar ball, permanently peering in the direction it had last been turned. Hugging cover, we made our way onto the cold shore and crossed the short distance to the nearest longhouse. We all had weapons drawn by now, except Burgundy. Fishig's auspex and motion tracker both indicated life signs close by, but how close they weren't telling. Thanks to the damn magnetic interference, we were forewarned, but as good as blind. We were non-verbal by now. I gestured and sent Ha ahead down the left side of the street, Fishig down the right. I'd have liked to deploy Kara too, but she was keeping to my orders and sticking close to Rassi, her assault weapon tight in her gloved hands. Rassi, his sombre, fur-trimmed robes flapping in the wind, had produced a multi-barrel pepper-pot handgun of exotic manufacture. Bequin hung back from me, so that her psychic deadness wouldn't conflict with my mind. For the trek across Miquol, she had changed her formal gown for a quilted bodysuit and stout boots, with a hooded cloak of dark green embroidered velvet wrapped around her. I noticed she had also left her long walking cane aboard the cutter. She had drawn a slim, long-nosed micro-las that I had given her on her 150th birthday. It had pearl-inlaid grips and was a custom masterpiece, an antique made by Magos Noel of Gehenna. The pistol suited her. It was slender and elegant and devastatingly potent. Up ahead I saw Fishig signal to Ha. Ha knelt down and gave the big man some cover as he crossed to the back door of the next longhouse. I sent Burgundy forward in support. Burgundy still hadn't drawn his hand cannons from their shoulder rig, and ran with an easy, loping gait. Once Burgundy had reached him, Fishig slipped inside the longhouse. There was a pause, and then Burgundy went in too. We waited. Burgundy appeared in the doorway and beckoned to us. It was good to be out of the damp, though the dark, rot-stinking interior of the old prefab barrack wasn't much better. We got inside, and Ha and Kara stood guard at the doorway, with Burgundy covering the front. Fishig had found something. Fishig had found someone. It was an old man, filthy, wizened, lice-ridden and diseased. He cowered in the corner, whining each time the beam of Fishig's hand lamp probed at him. If I'd passed him on the streets of Ariel, I'd have taken him for a beggar and not given him a second look. Out here, though, it was different. "Give me the lamp," I said. The old man, who seemed more animal than human, shrank back as I turned the hard white light on him. He was caked in filth, starving and gripped by fear. But, despite the dirt, I could recognize his robes. "Father? Father Hierarch?" He moaned. "Father, we're friends." I unclasped my rosette and held it out to show him. "I am Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn, Ordo Xenos Helican. We are here in an official capacity. Don't be afraid." He looked at me, blinking, and slowly reached out a dirt-blackened hand towards the rosette. I let him take it. He looked at it for a long time, his hands trembling. Then he started to weep. I waved Fishig and the others back and knelt down beside him. "What's your name?"
Dronicus.
"Dronicus."
Pater Herschel Dronicus, hierarch of the parish of Miquol. Blessed be the God Emperor of mankind.
"The God Emperor protects us all," I answered. "Can you tell me how you come to be here, Father?"
"I've always been here," he replied. "The soldiers may have gone, but while there is a chapel here, there is a parish, and so long as there is a parish, then there is a priest."
By the Golden Throne, this old fellow had lived here alone for 30 years, maintaining the chapel. "They never deconsecrated the ground?"
"No, sir, and I am thankful. My duty to the parish has given me time to think."
"Gomed, Morlock," Ha muttered. "Enough!" I snapped over my shoulder. "Let me see if I understand this right," I said to Dronicus. "You served here as a priest, and when the PDF abandoned the site, you stayed on and looked after the chapel?"
"Yes, sir. That is the sum of it."
"What did you live on?" asked Fishig, that detective brain looking for holes in the story.
"Fish,"
he said. From his astonishingly foul breath, I believed that.
"Fish. I went down to the landing point once a week and fished, smoking and storing the catch in the hangar. Besides, the soldiers left a lot of canned produce. Why, are you hungry?
No, said Fishig, unprepared for the generosity of the question. Why are you hiding in here? Beckwin asked softly. Dronicus looked at me as if needing my permission to answer. Go ahead, I nodded.
They drove me out,
he said.
Out of my hangar. They were mean. They tried to kill me, but I can run, you know.
I have no doubt. Why did they drive you out? Fishig asked.
They wanted the hangar. I think they wanted my fish.
I'm sure they did. Smoked fish. That's worth something out here. But they wanted something else, didn't they? He nodded, a bleak look on his face.
They wanted the space.
What for?
For their work.
What work?
They are mending their god.
I glanced sidelong at Fishig. Their god? What god is that?
Not mine, that's for sure,
Dronicus exclaimed. Then he suddenly looked reflective.
But it's a god, nevertheless.
Why do you say that? I asked.
It's big. Gods are big, aren't they?
Usually.
You said they,
said Rassi, crouching down next to me.
Who do you mean? How many of them are there?
Rassi's tone was admirably calm and reassuring, and I could feel the gentle bow-wake of the psychic influence he was cautiously bringing to bear. No wonder he had such a great reputation. I almost felt stupid for not asking such obvious questions.
The godsmiths,
the old priest replied.
I do not know their names. There are 9 of them, and also the other 9, and the 14 others, and the other 5.
37, breathed Fishig. Dronicus screwed up his face.
Oh, there's a lot more than that. 9 and 9 and 14, 5 and 10 and 3 and 16.
Rassi looked at me.
Dementia, he whispered. He's able to account for them only in the groups he's seen them. He's not capable of identifying a whole. They are just numbers of people that he's seen at various times.
I'm not stupid,
cut in Dronicus simply.
I never said you were, Father,
Rassi replied.
I'm not mad either.
Of course.
The old man smiled and nodded, and then, very directly, asked,
Do you have any fish?
Boss, Ha hissed suddenly. I rose quickly. What is it?
Movement, 30 meters.
His foresight was twitching as it downloaded the data. He knelt in the doorway and eased his rifle up to a firing position. What do you see?
Trouble. 8 men, armed, moving like an infantry formation, coming this way.
We must have tripped something on the way in, said Burgundy. I don't want to fight, not yet. I looked at the others. Let's exit that way and regroup.
We have to take him,
said Rassi, indicating the old priest. Agreed. Let's go. Burgundy opened the far door of the hut and led the way out. Beckwin followed him, then Fishig. Rassi reached out to help the old priest up.
Come on, Father, he said.
Seeing the hand coming for him, Dronicus yelped.
Shit, we're rumbled, said Ha. They're coming.
Lasfire, bright and furious, suddenly hammered at the doorway and blew holes through the rotten fibre ply. Kara dived down for cover. Ha kept his place, and I heard his long las crack.
One down, he said.
Rassi and I hauled the old priest to his feet and bundled him towards the back exit. Behind us, the long las cracked again and was joined by the chatter of Kara Swoll's assault weapon. Return fire hammered into the side of the longhouse, perforating the wall. Get him out, I told Rassi, and ran to the door. Standing over Kara as she fired, I shot several bolt rounds through the gaping window. Las shots seared down the street and burst against the side of the hut. I got a glimpse of figures in bulky grey combat fatigues scurrying closer and pausing to unload their las rifles in our direction. A sudden thought, true and clear, lanced into my brain. I grabbed Kara and Ha. Move! I howled. We had made it to the rear door when the grenade took the front off the hut. The entire doorway area where Ha had been crouching erupted in a flash of flame and shredded fibre ply. The blast rush blew us out into the street. Fischig hauled me up. "Go! Go!" Kara was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on her temple, and Ha was dazed. But we ran, dragging them with us, up the muddy roadway towards the main dish. 3 men in insulated combat armour raced into the street ahead of us, raising las rifles. Burgundy's Herticus pistols were in his hands faster than any of us could raise the weapons we already held. He blazed out twin streams of shots, the shell cases spraying out from the side slots of his weapons. All 3 men ahead of us lurched back and sprawled. Burgundy ran ahead, chopping down another 2 as they emerged, his handguns roaring. Then he dropped suddenly onto his back, rolled round and blasted another assailant off the roof where he had suddenly appeared. 5 more loomed behind us, breaking out of the rear door we had escaped through. Fischig and Kara turned, firing. They dropped 3 of them. Bequin brought down the 4th with a single, well-placed headshot. A round from my bolt pistol knocked the 5th 5 meters back down the road. "Thorn, desiring Aegis, pattern oath," my Vox suddenly squawked. Medea was monitoring the activity over the Vox link. "Negative. Thorn wishes Aegis repose under wing," I replied, using Glossia, the informal private code I shared with my staff. "Aegis stirred. The flower of blood. Aegis repose by the thrice ignited, as a statue to the end of earth. Gregor, let me come." "No, Medea. No!" We were in a serious firefight now. Las shots and hard rounds whipped in all directions. Fischig and Ha laid down heavy cover fire. Kara and Bequin selected targets more particularly and hit most of them. Burgundy blazed away with his matched handguns. I fired carefully, cautiously, keeping the old priest behind me. Rassi's fish and lock pepperpot banged and sparked and hailed lead balls at the enemy. Every few seconds he raised his cane and sent forth a drizzle of psychothermic flame from the silver tip. "Brace yourselves," I yelled. "You especially, Paul." He nodded. "Reveal yourselves," I urged, using the will at full force. Such a raw outburst would usually have floored all those around me, but Ha, Burgundy, and Kara had all been mentally conditioned during rigorous training to black out my psi streams. Bequin was untouchable, and Fischig wore a talk that protected him. Rassi, forewarned, put up a mental wall. The old priest screamed, stood up, and wet himself. He wasn't the only one to stand up. Our attackers rose into view, each one clutching a smoking weapon, each one blinking in dumb confusion. Burgundy, Fischig, and I cut them all down in a few lethal seconds. Victory. For a moment. Suddenly, Dronicus was running away down the street, and Rassi was doubled up by convulsions. I felt it too, a sudden jolt in the background psionic resonance, like a painfully bright flash of light. I staggered back and slammed into the side of the nearest hut. Blood spurted out of my nose. Burgundy and Kara fell to their knees. Ha sat down hard, sobbing. Even Fischig, protected by his talk, felt it and staggered. Elizabeth, the only one unmoved, glanced around us and yelled, "What? What is it?" I knew where it had come from. The hangar. I struggled upright in time to see the hangar roof quiver and buckle as something broke through it from inside. Something huge that smashed entire roof panels out of the way as it got to its feet. It must have been lying down in the hangar, I realized. Now it was rising and activated. What we had felt had simply been the backwash of its mind link going live. With dreadful certainty, I realized that Fade Thuring was going to be damn near impossible to stop. I had made an unbelievable, unforgivable mistake. I had underestimated him and his resources. He was nothing like the minor warp dabbler I had once let slip away. He had a titan, Emperor damn him. He had a battle titan. Chapter 4. Cruor Volt. Fleeing the Giant. A terrible long shot. Its name was Cruor Volt. It weighed 2,500 tons and stood 60 meters tall. Like all the great warlord-class battle titans, it was a biped, almost humanoid in its proportions. Hooved with immense 3-toed feet of articulated metal, its massive legs supported a colossal pelvic mount and the great riveted torso that housed its throbbing atomic furnaces. Broad shoulders provided ample space for turbo-laser batteries. Beneath the shoulder armor, the Titan's arms elevated the machine's primary weapons. A Gatling blaster as the right fist, a plasma cannon as the left. The head was comparatively small, though I knew it was large enough to contain the entire command deck. It was set low down between the shoulders, making the monster ogreish and hunched. I have seen Titans before. They are always a terrifying sight. Even the Imperial battle Titans are awful to behold. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who forge and maintain the war machines for the benefit of mankind, regard them as gods. They are perhaps the greatest mechanical artifacts the human race has ever manufactured. We have made more powerful things, the starships that can cross the void, negotiate warp space, and reduce continents to ashes with their ordnance. And we have made more technically sophisticated things, the latest generations of fluid-core autonomous cogitators. But we have made nothing as sublime as the Titan. They are built for war, and war alone. They are created only to destroy. They carry the most potent armaments of any land-based fighting vehicle anywhere. Only fleet warships can bring greater firepower to bear. Their image, bulk, their sheer size is intended to do nothing except terrify and demoralize a foe. And they are alive. Not as you or I would understand it, perhaps, but there is an intellect burning inside the mind impulse link that connects the drivers and crew to the Titan's function. Some say they have a soul. Only the priests of Mars, the adepts and tech mages of the cult Mechanicus, truly understand their secrets, and they guard that law ruthlessly. Perhaps the only thing more terrifying than a battle Titan is a Chaos battle Titan, the infamous metal leviathans of the arch-enemy. Some are manufactured in the smithies and forges of the warp, their designs copied and parodied from the Imperial originals, sacrilegious perversions of the Martian god machines. Others are ancient Imperial Titans corrupted during the Great Heresy, traitor legions that have lurked in the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years in defiance of the Emperor's will. Which this was, frankly, I cared little. It looked deformed, blistered with rust, draped with razor wire and covered with blade studs that sprouted like thorns. What I first took to be strings of yellow beads hanging from its shoulders and blade studs were actually chains of human skulls, thousands of them. Its metal was a dull, dirty black, and inscribed with the unutterable runes of chaos. Its head was a leering skull plated in glinting chrome. Its name was wrought in brass on a placard across its gigantic chest. It stepped forward. The ground shook. The ruptured roof panels of the hangar squealed as they tore and caved in around its swinging thighs. It strode through the fabric of the hangar like a man wading through a stream. The building's front burst out and fell away with a tremendous crash as the Titan broke its way through. And then it howled. Great vox horns fixed to the sides of its skull blared out the berserk war cry of the monster. It was so painfully loud, so deep in the infrasonic register, that it reflexively triggered primal fear and panic in us. The earth shook even more than it had done under the weight of its footsteps. It was coming our way. Now it was clear of the hangar, I could see the long segmented tail it dragged and whipped behind it. "Move!" I said, directing my will at my colleagues in the hope of snapping them into some sort of rational response. Every few seconds the rock under our feet vibrated as it took another step. We started to run through the streets of the deserted station, trying to keep as much of the buildings as possible between us and it. Our one advantage was our size. We could evade it by staying hidden. With a metallic screech of badly lubricated joints, it slowly turned its head and waist to look in our direction, and then stomped heavily round to follow us. It walked straight through a longhouse, shattering it like matchwood. "It knows where we are!" Rassi cried, desperately. "How can it?" Ha whined. Military-grade sensors, heavy-duty auspex, devices so powerful that they could overcome the island's magnetic distortions. This beast had been made to fight in horrifically inhospitable theaters, resisting toxins, radiations, vacuums, bombardments. It needed to be able to see and hear and smell and target in the middle of hell. The local magnetics that had bested our civilian instruments were nothing to it. "It's so big," Beckwin stammered. Another crash, another longhouse kicked over and splintered. A squeak of protesting metal as a derelict troop truck was pulverized underfoot. We turned back, running back almost the other way now, passing south of the chapel and the command center. Again, with an echoing grind of engaging joints, it came about and renewed its inexorable pursuit. I felt a spasm, a pulse on a psychic level. I was feeling the surge and flicker of its mind impulse link. "Get down!" I yelled. The Gatling blaster opened fire. The sound was a single blur of noise. A huge cone of flaming gases flickered and twitched around the blaster muzzles. A storm of destruction reigned around us. Hundreds of high-explosive shells hosed the street, blitzing the fronts of the buildings, pulping them. Firestorms sucked and rushed down the street. Billions of cinders and debris scarps sprayed all around. The stench of physaline was chokingly strong. I got up in a blizzard of ash and settling sparks. We were all still alive, if chronically dazed by the concussive force. Either the Titan's targeting systems were offset, or the crew were still getting used to its operation. The sensors might be capable of tracking our movement, but the Titan still had to get its eye in. Perhaps it could only sense us in a general way. "We can't fight that," said Fischig. He was right. We couldn't. We had nothing. This was so one-sided it wasn't even tragic. But we couldn't run either. Once we left the cover of the station's buildings, we would be in the open, and easy targets. "What about the gun cutter?" blurted Elizabeth. No, I said. "Even the cutter hasn't got enough kill power. It might make a dent, but it wouldn't stand a chance. That thing would shoot it out of the sky before it even got close." "But—" "No, it's not an option." "What is, then?" she wanted to know. "Dying? Is that an option?" We were running again, away from the burning zone of devastation. With another overwhelming blurt of decibels, the blaster cut loose again. A longhouse and part of the command center to our right disintegrated in a volcanic flurry of spinning wreckage and fire. There were walls of flame everywhere, gusting yellow and bright into the grey gloom. Burgundy led us down a side street between the ends of longhouses, Fischig and Kara Swole almost carrying the exhausted Rassi. We ducked down in the shadows against the rotting side wall. Hiding, we could no longer see the Titan. There was silence, interrupted only by the crackle of blazing fiber ply and the creak of prefab frames slowly slumping. But I could feel it. I could feel its abhuman mind seething malevolently through the deepest harmonics of the psych range. It was north of us, on the other side of the chapel and the store barns, waiting, listening. A vibrating thump. It was moving again. The rate of the footsteps increased as it picked up speed until the ground no longer had time to stop shaking between thumps. Pebbles skittered on the ground, and loose glass dislodged from the broken windows of the nearby longhouses. "Go!" growled Fischig. He broke and started to run east across the main street. The others began to follow his lead. "Fischig, not that way!" I leapt after him, grabbing him in the middle of the roadway. There was a groan of tortured metal, and the Titan itself appeared at the end of the street, traversing its mighty upper body to face us. Fischig froze in terror. I threw us both forward behind the rusted hulk of an old PDF troop carrier. Blaster fire ripped down the street, kicking up a wild row of individual impacts that pitted the rocky ground, demolished the edge of a barn, and filled the air with greasy flame, smoke, and powdered rock. A flurry of shots sliced through the shell of the troop carrier, splitting its fatigued armor wide open and hurling rusty shrapnel in all directions. The force of the hits actually lifted the carrier's mouldering bulk and spun it around, end to end. I dragged Fischig behind a longhouse and just prevented us from being crushed under the lurching metal shape. The carrier came to rest against the side wall of the prefab, stoving in the wall panels. The earth-shaking footsteps resumed. The Titan was advancing down the street. I looked at Fischig. He was dazed and pale. A ragged chunk of shrapnel had embedded itself in his left shoulder. It would have decapitated him if it hadn't been for the motion tracker unit strapped there. As it was, the tracker was a smouldering wreck, and blood poured from the hunk of metal projecting from his trapezius. "Holy Throne!" he murmured. I hoisted him up and glanced back across the street. Burgundy and Swole had managed to get everyone else back into cover before the barrage. I could see them through the smoke, huddled in the shadows. I raised my free hand and made gestures that were as clear as possible. I wanted them to back off and regroup. We would have to split up. There was nowhere we dared cross the open street in either direction. Fischig and I blundered off in the opposite direction, coming out in a drain gully behind the row of longhouses where a stream emptied down through the station to the lake. We crossed it using a small wire-caged footbridge, and then fell into cover on the far side of a machine shop. "Where is it?" Fishig wheezed in pain. I checked. I could see the huge machine towering above the prefabs 200 meters back, shrouded in the black smoke that was roiling up from its last onslaught. It had reached the old troop carrier and was standing there. It looked for all the worlds as if the giant war engine was sniffing the air. It turned again suddenly, filling the air with the sound of whirring gears and clanking joints, and smashed through the longhouse as it moved off after us. "It's coming this way," I told Fishig. We started to run again, across the levelled rockcrete apron of the machine shop, and then down the gently sloped street towards the command centre. Fishig had slowed right down. It was gaining on us. There was a distant booming roar that echoed around the entire lake basin. A ball of flame rose into the air from the very western end of the station area. "What the hell was that?" Fishig growled. The Titan clearly wanted to know too. It adjusted its path and moved away from us, striding towards the site of the unexplained blast, oblivious to the collateral damage it was leaving in its wake.
"That," said a voice behind us, "was the best diversion I could come up with."
We looked around, and there was Harlan Nail. Nail was a good friend and a respected member of my team. I hadn't seen the old bounty hunter since he had set off for Jura with Fishig's party to conduct the audit. He was a big man, dressed as always in a black combat-armoured body glove. With his heavy skull shaved and polished, and his grizzled face, he looked a fierce brute. But there was a grace to his movements and a nobility to his stature that always set me in mind of Valnus, the rogue hero of Cataldinus's epic verse allegory, The Once Pure Hive. He held a Vox-trigger detonator in his hand. We followed Nail into the shelter of a store barn, and the bounty hunter immediately began to field-dress Fishig's wound. The battle titan was still prowling around west of us, investigating the mysterious blast.
"I tried to raise you on the Vox, but the channels were screwed,"
Nail said. "Magnetics," I said. "How long have you been here?"
"Since first light. I rented a speeder to follow Thuring. It's hidden up in the hills on the far side of the lake."
"What have you found?"
Fishig asked, wincing as Nail sprayed his wound with antisept.
"Apart from the obvious, you mean?"
"Yes," I said.
"Thuring's got backing. Serious capital support. Maybe a powerful local cult we don't know about. More likely an off-world cabal. He's got manpower, resources, equipment. When I first arrived, I poked around, got a glimpse of what was in the hangar. That took my breath away, I can tell you. Then I borrowed one of his men and asked some questions.
Did you get any answers?"
A few. He was trained to resist.
I knew Nail's interrogation techniques were fairly basic. "How long did he last?"
About 10 minutes.
"And he told you—"
Thuring has known for some time that the Titan was here. Probably information received from his backers. It seems no one knew that Miqual was used by the arch-enemy as a Titan pen during the occupation. The bloody PDF were stationed here for years and never realized what was hidden just up there in the mountains.
I peered out of the barn door. The Titan had come about and was plodding back in our direction. I could taste its bitter psychic anger and feel the earth quivering under my feet. "Harlan!" He leapt up and came to join me. "Damn," he hissed, viewing the Titan. He took out his detonator again, selected a fresh channel, and thumbed the trigger. There was a flash, a rolling report, and another mass of fire blossomed from the western shore of the lake. The Titan turned immediately and stomped towards the fresh blast.
"It's not going to fall for that many more times," said Nail.
So, there was a Titan, that damn thing, abandoned and dormant in the mountains.
"That's about the size of it. Left behind in the mass retreat. Never found by Imperial liberators. Sealed in a shielded cavern, along with 2 more like it."
"3 Titans?"
snarled Fishig.
"They've taken this long to get just that one working,"
said Nail.
"Thuring's aboard that thing, commanding it personally. He's delighted with his new toy, even though it's not up to optimum. You'll notice it's only used its solid munition weapon. I don't think its reactors are generating enough juice yet to power up its energy batteries."
"Lucky us," I said.
What I can't tell you is why Thuring is restoring a monster like that.
There could be many reasons, I thought. He could be doing it on the behest of his rich sponsors, which seemed likely. He could be intending to sell it to the highest bidder. There were cult groups in the Ophidian subsector that would love to own that sort of power. He could even be working for some higher power, perhaps enlisted by the actual legions of the arch-enemy. Or he could be doing this for himself. That idea chilled me. Thuring was evidently a more significant player than I had estimated. He could have designs of his own, and with a battle titan at his command, those designs could be very bloody. He could hold cities to ransom, here on Jura or elsewhere. He could raise population centers, slaughter millions, particularly once the turbines of Krua Vault were operating at full power. Whatever the truth, the dismal fate of the Ekranoplane's crew told me he wasn't intending to leave the island the way he had come in. A bulk lifter could easily land here, pick up the Titan, and be away before the frankly paltry watch forces of Jura could react. Thuring was planning to leave here with the Titan. I knew that as a certainty. It didn't matter where he was going after that. Imperial blood would be spilled as a result. We had to stop him. Which brought me back to my original problem. How the hell were we going to fight that? Frantically, with the Titan now turning back from the second diversion, I considered the tools at our disposal. It was hard to concentrate, because the angry flutter of the Titan's mind link was interfering with my mind. I suppose that's what gave me the idea. The desperate idea. I reached to key my Vox link and then paused. The behemoth would detect Vox transmissions effortlessly. Instead, I stretched out with my mind, trying to find Rassi. "Nail," I asked, "what's the most secure structure here?"
"The chapel," he said. "It's reinforced stone."
I opened my mind fully.
"Thorn enfolds kin, within a seal, the worshipful place."
If Rassi could hear me, he wouldn't understand Glossia, but I figured he'd have the sense to consult the others. After a long pause, the answer came.
"Kin come to Thorn, in sealed worship, abrupt."
"Let's move," I told Nail and Fishig. We reached the chapel first. The dread Titan had begun to stride our way again by then, but Nail fired the last of his diversions and distracted it east. We tumbled into the ancient church. It was generally stripped bare and full of slimy black mould. A few remaining wooden pews were sagging with damp corruption. The double-headed eagle from the altar lay trampled on the floor. I noticed that its dented wings were polished brightly. Dronicus had tended this place fervently until Thuring's men had arrived and smashed up his diligently maintained shrine. It was a heartbreaking sight. I bowed to the altar and made the sign of the eagle across my chest with both hands. The others arrived in a hurry, weapons drawn, slamming the door shut behind them. Bequin, Ha, Begundi, Swole, and Rassi. Rassi was panting hard. Bequin was pale. Both Ha and Swole had cuts and contusions from near misses. "You have a plan?" asked Rassi, almost immediately. I nodded. "It's a terrible long shot, but I don't know what else to do." "Let's hear it," said Fishig. I do not pretend, as I have already reflected, to have any specific understanding of the workings of a battle titan. No man does, unless he be a priest of Mars or, like Thuring, the owner of illicitly transmitted lore. Amos probably knew a thing or two. I knew for certain he had seen Adeptus Mechanicus mind impulse units first-hand, for he told me as much, long before, in the cryogenerator chamber of the Tomb Vault Processional 212 on Hubris. But he was not with me in that chilly, ransacked chapel, nor was a decent conversation with him viable. However, I knew enough to understand that the function of a Titan depended on the connection between man and machine, between the human brain and the mechanical sentience. That was achieved, miraculously, through the psychic interface of the mind impulse unit, which meant, in very simple terms, that the root of our problem was essentially a psychic one, if we could disrupt or, better still, destroy the mind link. "This rune staff was made for me by Magos Geared Bure of the Adeptus Mechanicus," I told Rassi, letting him feel the weight of the weapon. It was a long, runic steel pole with a cap-piece in the form of a sun's corona, fashioned in electrum. The lodestone at the cap's centre was a skull, a perfect copy of my own, marked with the 13th sign of castigation that had been worked from a hyperdense geode of teleempathic mineral called the lith that Bure had found on Kinchair. It was a psionic amplifier of quite devastating power. We use it to boost our collaborating minds, force a way into the machine's consciousness.
Indeed. And then?
I glanced over at Elizabeth. Then Madame Bequin takes hold of the rune staff and delivers her untouchable blankness into the heart of it. Will that work? Kara Swole asked. There was a long pause. Bequin looked at me, and then at Rassi. I don't know. Will it? I don't know either, I said. But I think it's the best chance we have. Rassi breathed deeply.
So be it. I don't see another hope, not even a remote one. Let's get on with it.
Paul Rassi and I took the rune staff between us, our hands clamped around the long haft. He closed his eyes. I tried to relax, but the instinctual barriers of self-protection that exist in every mind kept mine from letting go. I didn't want to get inside that thing. Even from a distance, it stank of putrid power. It reeked of the warp.
Come on, Gregor,
Rassi whispered. I concentrated. I closed my eyes. I knew the Titan was treading nearer, because I could feel the chapel floor shaking. I tried to let myself go. It was like clinging to a precious handhold when you are dangling over a pit of corrosive sludge. I couldn't bear to submit and slide away. What waited for me down there was cosmic horror, a broiling mass of filth and poison that would dissolve my mind, my sanity, my soul. Chaos beckoned, and I was trying to find the courage to jump into its arms. I could feel the sweat dribbling down my brow. I could smell the rotten odor of the derelict chapel. I could feel the cold steel in my hands. I let go. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. Drowning. I was drowning, face down in black ooze. The sticky, fetid stuff was filling my nostrils and my ears, trying to pour like treacle down into my mouth and choke me. There was no up, no down, no world. There was just viscous blackness and the unforgettable smell of the warp. A hand grasped me by the back of the jacket and yanked me up. Air. I spluttered, puking out filmy strings of phlegm, stained black by the ooze.
Gregor! Gregor!
It was Rassi. He stood beside me, knee-deep in the warp mud. God, Emperor, but his mind was strong. I'd have been dead already but for him. He looked drawn and weak. Warp-induced pustules were spotting his face and crusting his neck. Blowflies billowed around us, their buzzing incessant in our ears.
Come on,
he said.
We've come this far.
His words came broken up as he was repeatedly forced to spit out flies that mobbed around his dry lips. I looked around. The sea of black ooze went on forever. The sky over our heads was thickly dark, but I realized that the billowing clouds were impossibly vast swarms of flies, blocking out the light. Firelights, distant, flashing, reflected across the slime. We were in the outer reaches of the Chaos Titan's mind link. Swathed in films of ectoplasmic ooze, we struggled forward, holding each other for support. Rassi was moaning. His psychic self had brought no Cain to support him. Flames underlit the horizon, and the sea of sludge rolled nauseatingly. I had not encountered a mental landscape this abominable since my first dreams of Cherubale, years before. Cherubale. Just the thought of him in my mind brought the flies rushing around me. The slime reacted too, popping and bubbling about my knees. I felt a keening, a sharp need that filled the polluted air around me. Cherubale. Cherubale.
Stop it, wailed Rassi.
Stop what?
Whatever you're thinking about, stop it. The whole world is reacting.
I'm sorry. I suppressed the notion of Cherubale in my mind with every ounce of my will. The tremors subsided.
Throne, Gregor. I don't know what you've got in your head. I don't want to know, said Rassi. But I pity you.
We trudged forward, first one of us slipping over, then the other, then one bringing the other down. The deep slime licked at us, hungry. Thousands of kilometers ahead of us, a source of power throbbed. I could dimly make out the silhouette of a man. But it wasn't a man. It was Cruorvult. Blood wills it. That would be the simplest low Gothic translation. The Titan stood there, distant, the master of this psychic realm. Demonic forms ghosted around us. Their spectral, screaming faces were madness to behold. They were like smoke, like shadow play. They snarled at us. Another few hundred meters, and images began to flash into my mind. We were breaking into the edges of the Titan's memory sphere. I saw such things. May the God Emperor spare me, I saw such things then. I stood on the brink and peered into the abyss of the Titan's memories. I saw cities die in flames. I saw legions of the Imperial Guard incinerated. I saw space marines die in their hundreds, scurrying around my feet like ants. I saw planets catch fire and burn to ashes. I saw Imperial Titans, proud warlords, burst apart and die under the onslaught of my hands. I saw the gates of the Imperial Palace on Terra through a blizzard of fire. I saw down through many thousands of years. I saw Horus, vile and screaming out his wrath. I saw the whole heresy played out in front of my eyes. I saw the age of strife and witnessed firsthand the dark age of technology that preceded it. I fell, plummeting through history, through the stored memory of Cruorvult. I saw too much. I started to scream. Rassi slapped me hard around the face. "Gregor, come on now! We are almost there!" We were at the heart of it all now, frail as whispers. We were in the bridge of the Titan, seeing the multiple overlapping spectres of the men who had commanded it, all sat in the Princeps' throne, all dead. Demons crouched on my back, writhed on my shoulders, gnawed at my ears and cheeks. I saw horror. Absolute horror. Beside me, Rassi reached out and touched the mind impulse unit built into the floor of the bridge. "Now, I think," he said. "Elizabeth!" I yelled. In the rank confines of the chapel, Bequin leapt forward and grabbed the rune staff from the hands of two inquisitors who were quivering with power, stress, and terror, our eyes rolled up blankly so that only the whites showed. She gripped the rune staff, focused her untouchable force, and... Chapter 5. My plan fails. Damn Vervuk all to hell. The unthinkable. She was killed. Not at once, of course. The back grip of the Titan's terrible sentience tore into her, overwhelmed her untouchable quality by dint of its sheer force, and broke her mind. Electrical discharge crackled down the haft of my rune staff, throwing Rassi and myself away and blasting Elizabeth back across the chapel. The scorch marks are still visible on the uncorruptible steel, the perfectly etched fingerprints of Paul Rassi, Gregor Eisenhorn, and Elizabeth Bequin. Nail told me afterwards that the psychic recoil had tossed Rassi and myself to either side like dolls, but the main force had been directed at Bequin. She had flown through the air a dozen meters, her cloak fluttering out, and cracked off the back wall of the chapel with a sound that Nail knew meant snapping bones. He ran to her, calling her name. Fischig lurched forward too. Rassi and I lay on the ground, weeping and gasping. The rune staff, steaming, had landed on the stone floor between us with a clang. My plan had failed dismally and completely. Blood trickling from my nose, I got up, Swole and Ha helping me. I had little idea where I was. Images of the age of strife still permeated my mind. "Rassi," I gasped. "Alive," said Burgundy, crouching next to the sprawled inquisitor. "But he's weak." "Elizabeth?" I asked softly, looking to where she lay. Fischig and Nail were huddled over her. Nail looked back at me and shook his head. "No," I said, pushing Kara Swole away as I stepped forward. Not Elizabeth. Not her. After all this time. "She's hurt bad, boss," Nail said. "I'll try to make her comfortable, but..." The tread of Cruorvult echoed outside. I staggered towards Bequin. She looked so still, so broken.
"Oh, sweet Emperor, please, no." "Inquisitor," said Ha, "we're dead now, aren't we? For sure."
I realized slowly that the Titan was right outside.
"What are you doing?"
Burgundy yelled at me. I had no idea. I was only partially conscious. I had Barbarisata in my fist and was running for the door. I think I meant to go out and face the Titan with my sword. That's how far gone I was. One man with a sword, intent on facing down a battle Titan. Before I could reach the door, I heard the scream of down jets and the chatter of cannon fire. I didn't have to look out to know it was my gun cutter. Damn Medea! Thorn to Aegis, the spite of justice! Belay! Belay! Thorn requires Aegis, the shades of eternity. Raise Adelphus pathway, pattern ivory. Thorn denies, the cover of stillness. Belay! Aegis responds to Vervuk, the matter, quite done. No! I bellowed. No! Medea's response had told me that she was following Bastian Vervuk's orders now. He had commanded her to take the gun cutter up. He had ordered her to attack the Titan. I honestly believe that he thought he was helping me, that he could do some good. Damn Vervuk! Damn Vervuk, all to hell! I ran outside in time to see the majestic raptor shape of my gun cutter burning in low across the PDF station, blazing its guns at the slowly turning Titan. The streams of high-caliber shells were just pinging off the giant's thick, armored skin. Cruor Volt turned with a scrape of metal against metal, raised its right fist, and fired. The conical flame flash of its muzzle gases, white hot to the point of incandescence, twitched and flickered around the Gatling blaster. The cutter bucked and lurched as the first round struck it. It tried to evade, but the air was too thick with pelting bolts. The ferocious salvo ripped the belly out of my beloved gun cutter and tore off a tail wing. Spewing flames and smoke, the cutter veered off, debris cascading away from its shredded hull. It tried to climb. Its main engines stalled out. Leaving a wide streak of smoke behind it in the air, the cutter banked violently to the left, ripped a wing strut through the edge of the ancient rusted dish, and dropped. It hit the shore of the lake, burying itself in the beach mud and shingle, leaving a smouldering groove 30 meters long behind it. I stumbled forward, trying to see, but the main bulk of the downed cutter was obscured by buildings. It was ablaze, I could tell that much. Cruor Volt began to pace slowly towards the beach. I had a sudden mental image of a hunter walking to his wounded quarry, preparing to fire a final point-blank kill shot. Around the corner of the next longhouse, I could see down the glinting shingle of the icy lakeshore. The Titan was crunching away from me, its vast treads leaving perfect indentations of pulverized pebbles behind it. The cutter was half on its side, a mangled, truncated wreck, driven down into the scree and hard, cold mud of the shoreline. Wretched black fumes were boiling out of its innards, and curls of steam were rising where the lake water was in contact with flaming debris. There was a little tinny bang, and an exit hatch blew out of the cutter's flank, fired off by explosive bolts. A figure, clearly injured, fell out of the hatch and began to struggle up the beach. It looked like Vervuk. The Titan was only 50 meters from the crashed vessel now, its feet lifting sprays of water as it strode through the beach-line shallows. I became aware of movement beside me. It was Ha, his long las raised and aimed at the Titan, a defiant gesture so full of courage it quite eclipsed its own basic stupidity. Kara Swoll was close behind him, anxiously accompanying Rassi, who had dragged himself out to join me. He looked half dead from his trials in the mind link, his eyes sunken and dark, his lips tight and bloodless. I wondered how the hell I looked. Burgundy followed after them. He'd holstered his pistols again. He knew firepower like that was pointless. Fischig and Nail had stayed by Elizabeth's side in the chapel. Rassi had my rune staff, and was using it to stay upright. "Get back," I said to them all. "Just get back. There's nothing we can do."
"We fight?" gasped Rassi. "We fight the arch-enemy in the name of the God-Emperor of mankind? Until we drop."
He raised my rune staff and used it to amplify his weary mind. Psychothermic energy, manifesting far more powerfully than it had done through his cane, spat at the towering back of the great Titan. I don't know if he hoped to hurt it. I don't know if he was so far gone by that stage to believe he could. I think he was simply trying to distract it from the cutter. Rassi's scorching arc of flame seemed so devastating as it swirled out of the rune staff beside me, so bright it hurt my eyes, so hot it singed my hair. But by the time it struck the Titan, its true scale was woefully revealed. It flared uselessly off the Titan's rear torso cowling. But still, he kept it going. The psychothermic fire turned green and then blue-white. Ha started to fire his weapon. I think Kara did too. Like kisses into the whirlwind, my old master Hapshant would have said. Kruor Volt raked the cutter's wreck with blaster rounds. The first few instants of the merciless blitz ruptured the hull, twisting it, deforming it, dashing shards of metal up across the shore and out over the lake, peppering it with splash ripples. The cutter seemed to writhe, as if it was trying to escape the bombardment. In truth, it was simply being shifted and jolted as the hurricane of shots hammered it from end to end and shredded it. Then it exploded. A big, bright flash, a cudgeling boom and a rush of shockwave. The blast ripped a hole in the beach and sent a significant tidal wave back across the lake towards the far side. Where the cutter had been, where Medea, Amos, and Daholt had been, was just a pit of leaping flame. Debris, water, and pebbles rained down painfully like an apocalyptic cloudburst. The Titan virtually disappeared in a sudden outrush of steam. Vervuk had been 50 meters from the wreck, stumbling inland the last I had seen him. When I dared raise my head from the rain of shingle, there was no sign of him. Its murder done, the battle Titan turned on us. I was knocked flat, and I struck my head so hard on a prefab wall I blacked out for a second. I discovered later that Burgundy had taken me down into what little cover was available with a desperate flying tackle. Kruor Volt had improved its aim. The cold island air was full of mineral dust from the pebbles and rock that had been atomized by its blaster fire. Rassi and Ha simply didn't exist anymore. They had been vaporized by the mega-grade military weapon. My rune staff, blackened but intact, lay on a wide patch of ground that had been transmuted to furrowed glass by the hideous alchemy of blaster fire. The only other trace of them was a small, broken section of Ha's las rifle. Kara Swole lay 20 meters away, where the blast had thrown her. She was covered in blood, and I was sure she was dead. And I was sure we were dead, too. Thuring had won. He had killed my friends and allies in front of my eyes, and now he had won. I had nothing left to fight him with. I had nothing that could take on the power of a Titan. I'd had nothing when this one-sided duel began, and I sure as hell had nothing left now. An idea came upon me, insidious and foul, wrenched into the light by the extremity of my position. I shook it off. It was unthinkable. The notion was revolting, inexcusable. But it was also true. I did have something. I had something more powerful than a Titan. If I dared use it. If I had the audacity to unleash it. Unthinkable. Unthinkable. Kruor Volt thundered towards me through the ebbing stream. I could hear the whine of the autoloaders in its massive Gatling assembly, connecting up fresh munition hoppers. I could see the beach pebbles at my feet, thousands of them, skipping slightly with every step it took. Bex. Sir. Get Kara. And run. Go for the chapel. Sir, Do it now, I willed, and he sprang up, running fast. I crawled over to the rune staff and grabbed its haft. It was hot to the touch and sticky with blood. Duclain Ha and Paul Rassi would have to serve as the sacrifice, I realized pragmatically, already disgusted with myself. There was no time, no opportunity to do anything more elaborate. As it was, I had scarcely any of the tools, devices, unguents, charms, or wards that I would normally have believed necessary to undertake an action like this. I caught myself. Until that very moment, I had never even considered undertaking an action like this, no matter the preparations. Kneeling on the vitrified ground in the path of an oncoming Chaos Battle Titan, holding upright in both hands a rune staff slick with the blood residue of two beloved friends, I began the incantations. It was hard. Hard to remember word perfect the pertinent verses of the Malus Codicium, a work I had studied on and off for years in secret. These were writings I had been eager to learn and understand, but which filled me with dread all the same. After my first sabbatical to study the Codicium, just a few months after the execution of its previous owner Quixos, I had been forced into retreat to recover, and required counselling from the abbots of the Sacred Heart Monastery on Alsor. Now I was trying to remember the same passages, driving myself, struggling to repeat writings I had once struggled to erase from my mind. If I got even a word wrong, a phrasing, a point of vocabulary, we would all be dead at the hands of an evil far worse than Cruor Vult. Chapter 6. Chaos against Chaos. The Price. The Consequence. A moment. A freezing classroom many years before. Titus Endor and myself, shivering in our seats at ebonwood desks,